Riding habits, the wonderfully tailored and amazingly elegant garments that sometimes leave you wondering, do they actually wear that to ride horses? I want to try making my own 18th century riding habit using this Mill Farms pattern and fabrics in my stash. I got this pattern from the Burnley and Trowbridge website, and I'll include a link to it down below. This pattern includes instructions for the jacket, waistcoat, and petticoat, but for this iteration I will just be making the jacket. My intention for this project is to create a wearable mock-up so that I can become familiar with the construction techniques and shapes so that I can make other riding habit styles in the future. I'm going to use this pink wool fabric in my stash to create the jacket. I'm not even sure if it's really wool, and I never bothered to check. It was one of the first fabrics I bought when I started historical sewing, and this wool fabric taught me that not all wools are pleasant to work with. It's thick and scratchy, and I think it'll honestly live its best life as a jacket. This soft rosy pink color will work really well with the petticoats that I already have. I wanted to bring in some of that early 2000s emo military style aesthetic into this jacket, so I've decided to decorate it with rows of black velvet ribbon across the front, a black velvet collar, and black velvet cuffs. I also feel like the black will be a nice contrast to the soft pink wool fabric. Alright, so first impressions, the fit through the bust is great. I feel like these darts are a little high. Possible issues, obviously there's much more in the front width than I need. This is just a lot of extra considering there's only ½ an inch seam allowance. This is my waistline, even with the stays. I'm quite short-waisted, I'm only 5'4". The waistline on the pattern does extend beyond the waist. It just seems like the proportions are off. It might work for someone who's taller, but for me it just seems like the proportions are off by having this front point go so far down. And it's also causing these wrinkles. So good rule of thumb when you're fitting to follow the wrinkles. And my back is fine, so the back is cut in one piece without a waist seam. But the front where I have a waist seam, look at these wrinkles. If I follow the wrinkles, they're pointing to this just extra fullness at the waist here that I really could control by just raising this piece up and having it fall at the natural waist, at my natural waist. Look at that. Look at the difference. It's just proportionally a bit better for my small frame. Things that are good about the sleeves, the arm side and where it falls on my shoulder, I think are perfect. However, the width and the length are issues. I did see in some men's jackets from the time period that they did have a bit of elbow gap. And as you can see, I'm wearing my fuller chemise with this mock-up just to test, and there's still a lot of fullness, especially in the elbow area, especially when I bend it. There's just a lot of extra material. And I know that this bottom part is supposed to be folded up and the cuff sewn on top, so let's see if that changes the look. Oh, that looks a little bit better. One thing to keep in mind when you're working with velvet is to test the direction of the velvet. So velvet fabric has a nap, which means that it's got these raised fibers that'll look different in different lights and how it's hanging. So I want to see in what direction should I cut the cuffs. I have a scrap of my velvet here with the selvage edge still attached, and I'm just seeing in what direction does the color look deepest. Does it look most rich? Because that will change depending on the angle of the fabric. So if I change it now, so if we were cut parallel to the selvage rather than perpendicular, it might not come up on camera, but visually to me it looks a little more gray and the color looks less deep. I'm not getting that rich, intense black, and this is just because of how the pile is catching the light. And it actually feels a little bit rough. That's a test you can do. Putting your hand on the velvet and seeing in what way it feels soft is an indicator of in what direction you should cut the velvet. So after my little test, I've determined that I actually want to cut the cuffs perpendicular to the selvage. I've basted down the center front fold, and now I'm going to trim away the excess on this inside bit, leaving about 3/4 of an inch for seam allowance. but this way I know that this is exactly my center front line. Onto the collar. As you can see, I've taken out quite a bit in the neck area, and I've also decided to lower the neck a little bit. So I've just got a mock-up piece of collar here in a scrap textile, and I'm just going to pin it to the jacket just to see how it ends up. Because the collar is cut on the fold in the center back, I only cut out half of it, I'm just lining it up with the center back of the jacket. Now this is interesting. This is where I want to lower it to. So my new seam allowance, which I'm going to match up, is going to be closer to up here. Now that I've pinned it to my new seam line at the front, obviously my collar is too big, which makes sense because I've taken out a bunch from the front here. Right here is where the seam of the collar needs to be. And then adding ½ inch seam allowance should get me to about there. I've shortened my collar piece, and I'm just pinning it again back onto my jacket because I want to make sure that it fits perfectly fine around the neckline before I cut out my black velvet. So I've just pinned it in place, and as we can see, the front lines up, so this ½ inch here is seam allowance, perfect fit. All right, so it's time to cut out the final fabric for the collar. I stitched the jacket back pieces, front pieces, and skirt pieces together with a sewing machine. As always, I pressed my seam allowances to help them lie flat, which would have been easier if I had a wooden clapper. I pressed the seam allowances of the skirt's side seams. There is a pleat that covers the skirt side opening, which I pressed into place. I also pressed the bust dart downwards. This pattern comes with two options for a collar, a standing collar or a falling collar. I chose to make the standing collar because I felt like it would provide more warmth in cold weather. I sewed the two velvet collar pieces right sides together, then clipped and trimmed the seam allowances and turned it right side out. I then carefully pinned and sewed the collar along the neckline. Now it's time to assemble the sleeves, and the pattern is a little ambiguous. Please mind the mess on my ironing board. This cotton velvet just sheds these little balls of fluff, and it freaks me out because I look around and it looks like there's a bunch of ants or spiders all over my stuff. The pattern does tell us to match up the front seam of the cuff with the front seam of the sleeve and the back fold of the cuff with the back seam of the sleeve. It also tells us to sew this wider bottom curved edge to the bottom of the sleeve. In this sleeve construction, most of the sleeve is essentially a facing for the cuff. So this will get folded back, and then our cuff will sit on top of the sleeve like so, with obviously all the raw edges turned inside. So how are we going to achieve this? I have a sleeve here where I already tried mocking this up at least 5 times until I got it right. And the first step is turning our sleeve inside out. So we've got our front seam right here. We are going to take our cuff and right sides to right sides, we are going to slip the cuff inside the sleeve. On our back seam of the sleeve, we're going to open up the seam allowance so that it's flat. And then finding that center back fold of the cuff, we're going to line it up along the seam. On the front seam of the sleeve, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to open up that seam allowance so that it's flat. Open up the seam allowance of the front seam of the cuff. Match them together. Now we're going to go all the way around the sleeve, pinning up along this edge. Alrighty, now that we have our sleeve all pinned, we're just going to do a sense check before we sew. It's easier to change out pins than it is to remove stitches and resew. So I'm going to turn my sleeve right side out. There we are, and this is the correct configuration for the sleeve and cuff. We'll have a raw edge here and the fold of the sleeve. Obviously this isn't pushed through all the way, but the lining will come up, The sleeve cuff seam allowance will be folded down. The lining seam allowance will be folded on top of that. And then we see the seam allowance up here remains perfectly encased. And of course, turn everything back the proper way so that you can sew it.
Here, my cuff has been sewn onto the sleeve and I'm folding the sleeve facing in place. This was a really awkward way to make the sleeve cuffs and I hated every minute of it. To keep the cuff and facing from moving out of place, I sewed them together at the sleeve opening with whip stitches.
Right now I'm on the step of cutting out the sleeve lining, which I'm just cutting out from a scrap of brown linen that fits my sleeve pieces perfectly. It's not indicated on the sleeve pattern itself, but you actually need to cut the sleeve lining a little bit shorter at this step or trim it down later, and because I have so little fabric, I am just saving myself the extra 4 inches now and trimming it. And the reason you need to have the sleeve lining shorter than the outer sleeve is because the construction of the sleeve is as follows. So I have an outer sleeve here, and I have it marked here at the cuff fold line. So essentially when it comes to making our cuffs, we're going to attach our cuff to the bottom of the sleeve. Then we're going to fold the sleeve upwards like this and flip the cuff down so that we get the right side out of the cuff here. Then we have the raw edge of the cuff that will be tucked inside and covered by the raw edge folded down of the lining. If we were to cut the lining the same way as the sleeve, what would happen when we get to this step is we have our cuff over our sleeve, and then we have a whole extra 3 or 4 inches of our sleeve lining hanging out that we'd have to trim down, keeping in mind that we just need a little bit of seam allowance to cover up the raw edges of that cuff. So I'm preemptively shortening my sleeve pattern. So we have our cuff folds line. This is where our cuff is going to end with its own extension of seam allowance. And I'm just going to fold the sleeve up, but still maintain about 1/2 inch of seam allowance here, so that essentially this seam allowance is going to fold up and conceal the raw edges of the cuff.
I sewed the sleeve linings to the bodice lining, basically making a shell of the jacket. I clipped, trimmed, and pressed my seams. Then I lined up the linen shell with the jacket and stitched it in place. I decided to use linen for the bodice lining and a cheap silk for the skirt lining because this is what extant pieces seem to have as well. I used black thread when sewing the lining to the black collar and pink thread when sewing the lining around the edges of the front opening of the jacket. Now that I had my jacket and lining mostly assembled, I decided to try it on for a second fitting, and there were so many problems. Because I didn't use interfacing on the bodice, there was some buckling and wrinkling happening over the bust. My basted on velvet trim was uneven, and worst of all, the sleeves were still really baggy and bulky, uncomfortable and unflattering.
I really do not need this much material. I can taper out some of the excess material here in the sleeve and even in the elbow. I don't need it to be tight, but I just don't need all of this fabric. And what happened was, when I put in the lining of the sleeve in this thicker linen, it just made the sleeve look thick. It looks like a solid, it's freaking me out. This is not how arms look. This is not how sleeves look. When I bend, all of the folds are really defined in a creepy way. They're not soft folds. And then even from the shoulders, I'm getting this really awkward fold, and I can feel that it's the stiff linen underneath the sleeve that's just crammed up in there in that fold. And when I look at my test sleeve without the lining, there's a fold there, but it's soft. I'm okay with there being a few wrinkles of fabric here, because this is what allows me to have an incredible range of motion in this jacket. This just looks chonky. It feels hot. It feels stiff. I do not like it. Folks, this is a lesson that not all linens are created equal. I should have saved this linen for interlining stays or interlining a bodice, maybe some kind of Renaissance bodice, because even though it's loosely woven, you can see the light through it. The fibers themselves individually are quite stiff. It's filling out the sleeve, it's all folded up inside the sleeve. Even though it's cut as the exact same piece as the sleeve, it is just all folded and bunched up in there. Freaking hate it, okay? I can't. I feel really bad that I wasted this length of fabric. I'm going to remove the linen sleeve lining from the remaining sleeve.
I trimmed almost an inch off of the sleeves and cut new sleeve linings for my silk fabric, which I carefully sewed to the lining with a whip stitch. The whip stitch is my favorite and most versatile stitch. I then whip stitched the bottom of the sleeve lining to the bottom of the sleeve, covering up the stitches I made earlier to keep the cuff and facing in place. Now to finish hemming the jacket skirt. I pressed up the seam allowance on the wool and clipped the curve to help it lay smoothly. I repeated this on the silk lining. I pinned the lining to the wool, making sure that the lining was a bit shorter than the wool so that the lining wouldn't peek out. Then it was just a matter of stitching the lining and the wool together, which I did with a hem stitch. The hem stitch takes a few threads from the outer fabric with each stitch, but it creates a really neat effect if you're careful with the size of your stitches. I want to share a few tricks for how I get these really flat corner hems. When I'm pressing up the hem allowance on the outer fabric, I've pressed it in this direction. And when I'm pressing the hem allowance on the lining, I'm pressing it in this direction. And the fold of the lining is covering any raw edges or fold edges from the outer fabric. And I'm going to show you how to do that. I've actually taken apart this hem here to show you my mistakes. Originally, I had left all of this seam allowance turned under. As you can see, this is actually the selvage edge of the lining, so I don't know if I had just cut extra, and I don't know what I did. This was months ago. I'm coming back to an unfinished project, so some things can get a little wonky. First things first, I want to take my corners, which have been ironed, and I just want to open them up, and I want to cut out from this inner square right here, which represents the amount of fabric that gets folded and tucked inside. I don't need all this fabric in these seam allowance folds, so I'm going to open it up and cut inside that square. I don't want to cut past or too close to where the points of the ironing are, like this four-cornered fold area, because if I cut too close to that, then I won't get this nice little fold there and the fabric will start to fray. Okay, then my next step is I want to trim the seam allowance. There we go. And now I'm going to do the exact same thing on my outer fabric. So I've pressed my seam allowances for the outer fabric all the way in, and I'm going to unfold and trim just inside this little square. So when I go back to fold my seam allowance, it doesn't matter which one goes in which direction, I just want to make sure that they interlock. Because if I were to stack these guys like this, then I still get raw edges showing on this bottom corner, and that's what I want to avoid. So instead, I'm going to take my lining and I'm going to open it out. You could press it if your fabric needs to, but this fabric finger presses pretty well. So I'm matching up my seam allowance of my lining, and I am just going and tucking under ever so slightly around the raw edge of that outer fabric. I've got my outer fabric seam allowance turned this way, and I'm tucking in my lining seam allowance around the outer fabric, and it creates this little lining fabric sandwich. This is easy to sew by hand. I've actually never tried sewing corners like this by machine, but I'm sure you could. And there you have it, a nice, flat, low-profile corner with your lining and outer fabric and no raw edges showing anywhere. Making your own fabric-covered buttons is super easy, and it's a great way to upcycle buttons you otherwise wouldn't use. I made a pattern from thick paper and cut out circles of silk fabric left over from my Edwardian shirtwaist. I made a line of stitching around the circle, then dropped my button into the middle of its new fabric hat. I pulled on the stitches to gather the fabric around the button, then sewed a few back stitches to secure and tighten the gathering. I sewed 3 buttons onto each sleeve cuff. 2 buttons were sewn through the cuff and the sleeve to help keep the cuff in place, and the last button was just sewn through the cuff. I also sewed buttons onto the side back seams to highlight the skirt pleats. I marked the placement of the black velvet ribbon decoration with chalk. The strips were placed about 2.5 inches apart, with the topmost strip laid over the bust dart. I carefully sewed the velvet ribbon onto the jacket with silk thread, then unpicked the stitches and re-sewed them, and unpicked and re-sewed again, because even with my careful measuring, I struggled to get these to line up. To keep the jacket closed, I sewed on hooks and eyes, but there was still some gaping, so eventually I'll have to add a few more. I actually like when projects have little details like that I can come back later and fix. Underneath my riding habit, I'm wearing stays and a cotton hand-sewn men's style shirt. I'm overlapping and pinning the collar to mimic the look of wearing a cravat. I'm just wearing the shirt under my stays because wearing my shift and the shirt seemed needlessly redundant. Looking at portraits from the mid-18th century, it appears that women wore peigné under their riding habits, so I'm tying on my pair of linen pocket hoops. I'm wearing my lavender silk taffeta petticoat with the jacket, because I feel like the pink and purple tones coordinate nicely. I'm honestly stunned that this jacket turned out as lovely as it did. I came into this project thinking I'd be making a quick and easy wearable mock-up, but now I have a garment that I feel truly proud of. I feel like the design and colors really represent my aesthetic, and this jacket is so comfortable and cozy to wear. There were several times during this project where I was tempted to throw the whole thing into the trash. The pattern was rudimentary, and the instructions assumed the maker had a lot of previous historical sewing knowledge. It wasn't ideal for visual learners like myself. I almost can't believe that I spent several months trying to understand how to make these sleeves and cuffs. I also could have avoided fit and finishing issues with this jacket if I had been more diligent with clipping and trimming seams earlier in the process. At one point, I had almost completely disassembled the jacket so that I could trim those bulky wool seams. I think this jacket would look extra cute with some ruffles on the cuffs. Let me know in the comments below if you think I should add some ruffles. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like down below, and if you'd like to follow more of my trials and triumphs with historical sewing, please follow my channel.
Oh, and I just felt a pin fall to the floor. Okay, great, and now I don't know, okay, the floor is lava. I just heard a pin fall to the floor and I cannot see it, so I cannot move from this spot.